Now it's time for On Point, where we speak to experts to delve deeper into some of the key issues in the spotlight right now. The Ukraine-Russia conflict is now nearing the 3-month mark, yet there seems to be no end in sight, with Russia continuing offensives in eastern Ukraine.
Still, assistance from the international community continues to flow in, while Ukraine does all it can to fight off the Russian forces. But what's the end game? How does this all end for the two countries in conflict? To discuss this, we connect with Raphael Cohen, Director of Strategy and Doctrine Program at RAND Corporation. Very good morning to you. Thank you for joining us. And well, first off, how do you assess the situation in Ukraine right now after over 2 months of conflict?
Great. Well, first off, thank you so much for having me. I think there are two major trends going on in Ukraine right now. First, I think you're seeing a narrowing of the conflict. It's narrowing geographically in the sense that while there are airstrikes in Lvov or in Odessa, much of the most intense ground fighting is really concentrated in the Donbas, in that eastern region, as you mentioned in your introduction. It's also narrowing in the second sense as well, in the sense that if you monitor the rhetoric coming out of Moscow, they've ratcheted back some of their initial war aims. It's no longer talk about trying to overthrow the Zelensky government. It's now much more concentrated, particularly vis-a-vis the Donbas, into those sort of Russian-speaking regions. There's a second trend, however, going on as well, which is slowing. While both sides are continuing to fight, neither side is making particularly dramatic progress. So you saw over the weekend Ukrainian forces take areas in and around Kharkiv, that's Ukraine's second major city. You've seen Russian forces make incremental progress in the Donbas. All of this is sort of small progress on the ground, but neither side is able to really strike a decisive blow.
Interesting reports coming out before that the EU is looking into Ukraine joining the European bloc. Now, how do you suppose Russia will respond to that if Ukraine does indeed join the EU?
Well, I think it's important to realize just how weak a hand Russia has to play at this point. It has already committed much of its ground forces, in particular, to the Ukraine conflict. And at least if you believe the reports, say, from the British Ministry of Defense, about a sort of their total combat power at this point has been destroyed. So there's a limit to what the Russians can do militarily, particularly if they are unwilling to declare mass mobilization in Russia, which thus far they haven't been willing to do. What they can do is respond on a more symbolic level. They can hold referendums in captured cities, where you would have a result saying that those areas want to join Russia. Those referendums would be highly suspect, but it would be sort of a diplomatic quid pro quo for a Ukrainian bid to join the EU.
And while Finland and Sweden have they've voiced their intentions to join NATO, and we know why they're so set on joining, of course. And while President Vladimir Putin of Russia, he's shown that he's not too concerned about this. How do you see Russia really responding to their membership when it happens?
Sure. So to go back to what I said before, which is Russia at this point does not have too many military options on the table left. Both Finland and Sweden are militarily quite capable in and of themselves. They've also had a variety of security guarantees by the UK, by the other Nordic countries, by the French. So at this point, Russia really cannot afford to fight a second front conflict. So the idea that there would be some sort of military response, I think, is highly unlikely. What Russia can do is some of what they've already done over the weekend, which is cut Finland off from the electricity grid. That accounts for about 10% of Finland's electricity supplies. So they can do sort of economic measures like that. They can try to pressure it. There may be things they can do in the cyber realm. But again, Russia has at this point a very weak hand to play. And so the amount of actual leverage they have over a Finland or Sweden accession to NATO is quite limited at this point. And I think this is partly one of the reasons why Putin has had to sort of ratchet down his rhetoric about Finland and Sweden joining NATO.
So I guess that kind of leads us to our final question. I mean, what's the end game here, right? I mean, this certainly can't end well for Russian President Vladimir Putin. Not to mention, I mean, there's some rumors circulating about his health conditions as well. So what would you say is the best outcome for this war in Ukraine?
Well, I mean, so the best outcome is that the Ukrainians win. I mean, I think that's the best outcome from the West's perspective, for Ukraine's perspective. If you're Putin's perspective, I think what you have to hope at this point is that the West loses interest in Ukraine over time, and then concerns about a global food shortage, for instance, begin to mount such that we put pressure on the Ukrainian government to cut some sort of deal with Russia. I personally don't see that as likely. I think the more likely outcome is that you're stuck in this protracted war of attrition, which ultimately, I think, favors Ukraine for two reasons. First off, Ukraine really is fighting for survival, which Russia is not. So there's a motivation question here, too. And then second, the reason why a war of attrition would favor Ukraine over the long haul is that because the United States and many of our Western allies and partners are sending billions of dollars in military aid, Ukraine has a way of making good its losses in a way that Russia does not. So I think the conflict can drag on for quite some time, but barring Russia calling mass mobilization or employing the nuclear option, it's ultimately going to go in Ukraine's favor.
Well, thank you very much for your insights this morning, Dr. Cohen. Looking forward to speaking with you again in the future.
Thank you so much for having me.